A common problem we've heard in the 2024 season is setup changes being made by Lewis Hamilton. In multiple Grand Prix, he's addressed that the setup change he's made the car worse rather than better. It's something we've heard since these floor regulations have been a thing. Lewis has been talking about the setup being a problem, being so hard to find the perfect window for the Mercedes car, and it constantly hurting him in the race, whether that be through understeer, oversteer, a unpredictable car. There always seems to be something going on with the setup, and specifically from Lewis Hamilton's side. I want to talk about what the drivers actually have input for on the setup and what they can change in the car going into a race weekend. Also mentioning Lewis Hamilton and why these setup problems keep coming from him on his side of the garage. And is Lewis Hamilton the problem, or is it the car? Before getting into the bigger part of the video, wanted to thank you guys as I usually do. You guys are the best. Thank you for supporting the channel. Genuinely means the world for me. If you're new here, I'd love if you join. Just hit that subscribe button, it'd mean a lot to me. But let's get started with the Lewis Hamilton video. I talked a lot about Lewis Hamilton's driving style, why this is the worst start of a season he's ever had in Formula 1, and what he prefers in a car, whether it's understeer, oversteer, the balance in the car, what he generally likes while driving. I think it was a very good video, so go check it out, but that's not what I'm going to be covering here, only slightly. I first want to talk about setup. Setup in a Formula 1 car is addressed so much, not even just through Lewis Hamilton, but in general, we hear through the teams a perfect setup window, or what's the setup going into a Grand Prix, and I'm not sure if most people know what that means. The setup of the car is a combination of a lot of things being put together to give you a perfect balance in a car. That could mean having a little bit of understeer, could also mean having a little bit of oversteer, but there's a lot of properties in the car that they change to try and achieve this. Now, a lot of this work is done back in simulations before going into the Grand Prix that engineers discuss what would be the most optimal window to have our car working in for this Grand Prix. Drivers do have an input, and when they drive in their free practices or qualifying, whatever it may be, they can address these and change a few things on the car to try and get a better balance for it. The first, the most obvious one is front wing angle. Front wing and rear wing goes together when looking at this. If your front wing is not aligned correctly with your rear wing, the balance can be iffy. Adding a little bit more front wing rather than rear wing can give you a more oversteery car. Some drivers prefer this. Max is your perfect example. Having a bit more rear wing angle gives you a better downforce on the rear part of your car. This is something that Lewis prefers. But generally, you want to be pretty close on both the angles and have them aligning with the car to give you the best balance in a car. As I said, it's a preference from oversteer to understeer, but these changes can matter a lot, and through the Grand Prix, you will see in the pit stops that they try changing the front wing angle to address understeer or oversteer. This will commonly happen throughout a Grand Prix anytime a car pit stops, to try and get that perfect balance through the Grand Prix to be good on its tires and give the driver a better overall balance. Now, anti-roll bar is something that I don't think gets talked about enough, and that depends on if you go with a stiffer anti-roll bar or a softer anti-roll bar. Starting with a stiffer anti-roll bar, this could give you more rotation but makes the car a little bit more loose for low speed. This also tends to hurt the tires more in high-speed corners. While a softer anti-roll bar is better for high speed but gives more understeer but can also be very beneficial for tire wear. Drivers have to address this before going into the Grand Prix, and this change can be very impactful, especially in these high tire degradation tracks, but also tracks that have a lot of low speed or a lot of high speed. The rear cambers in the car also provide for a better balance. That's the best way to describe it. Mechanical balance as a whole. Now, the suspension setup, how you go with it. Do you want it stiffer? Do you want it softer? Having a stiffer suspension setup means you're going to be better in the high-speed corners, but going over curbs, this will be an issue. On tracks like Monaco, also the Chinese Grand Prix that we recently had, curbs can be a problem, and going over them can be a big issue. The car becomes unstable, you lose a lot of speed, and this can be a big problem. Now, if you go for a softer suspension setup, this allows you to go over the curbs much more, but you have less stability through the high-speed corners. This also can play a factor into tire wear, and this is usually addressed through the FP sessions and cannot be changed without breaking parc fermé in qualifying or the race. And the most important element that drivers can change going into these Grand Prix is ride height. As for ride height, a 0.1 millimeter change can completely impact the whole entire car. We saw a TD directive we got in Belgium of 2022, how much that impacted car performance and speed. These floor regulation cars could be even quicker than they are if we didn't have that regulation change. This matters and varies from car to car. Some cars prefer the car to be super low to the ground, while other cars you have to have it at a certain height because of porpoising and in general the car bouncing in certain speeds. The Mercedes actually has a huge problem with this, and I will address this more in the video. Overall setup is very complicated, but from what the F1 drivers have said and from what I've heard in podcasts and overall videos, these are the biggest things that F1 drivers can change. This is what they speak about with their engineers when they go into the race weekend and after the free practice sessions. Now, why is it that Lewis Hamilton is the one that always seems to be getting caught out with these setup changes? He specifically addressed in China that this was the worst setup change he's pretty much ever made. And going from a P2 in the sprint race to qualifying P18, yes, getting up to P9 in a better race, but having a car that was super understeery. Now you could say that he could change the front wing angle, make it more simple, oversteer a little bit, but with these cars, it's much more complicated like that. As I said, it has to be a unison with the anti-roll bar, the suspension, the front, the rear wing, the ride height. It all has to work perfectly for you to be able to do those types of combinations. The car matters a lot in this department. For example, the Red Bull car and this RB20 has a super huge operating window, meaning you can shift these changes a lot more than you can in the Mercedes W15. Lewis Hamilton doesn't have much to lose this season. He's going to Ferrari, he wants to try some setup changes, he doesn't really care to get a P8 or 9, he wants to try and win. This was the same thing he was going for in 2022, and while I do think this makes him look a lot worse on track because the car is much worse, especially stability and balance wise, it seems like a smart move to do before you're going to another team. He doesn't have much to lose this season, there really isn't anything at stake here, and Mercedes probably wants him experimenting more than George Russell, who they're trying to make their golden boy for now. Lewis does make the wrong changes as he's addressed here in China, and sometimes it just isn't the right way. With the car being weird in simulations, it's tough to judge. Is Lewis the problem? Is the car the problem? Well, we do have a source saying the actual problem comes from the car. Now, you can look at this as bias or not, but Frederick Vesti says the car is the problem, it's not Lewis. It's mainly because of the operating window and the actual simulator. What he's doing over there to try and change the car setup isn't properly going onto the track. Now, we've heard this problem from 2022 to now, and it's such an annoying problem to address because constantly Mercedes doesn't seem to get a handle on this. The car does seem to be a little bit better in stability in some parts, but as soon as they try making a setup change, something that's a little bit more drastic than before, they lose a whole bunch of performance and the car is seemingly nowhere. I'd like to think a 7-time world champion knows what he's doing in the car, and sometimes he makes these changes to try and get the best out of the W15. I do think we've seen a lot of complaints from him. Nico Rosberg made a good point saying that George Russell has said the car's pretty much the same, but then Lewis says it's not the same. I understand both points, and I can see as to how this seems for George Russell, who's probably driving the same car but doesn't really address much, and same for Lewis. He doesn't have much to lose. He needs to go for more extreme changes to see what he can get out of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. I feel like this is a common thing going around from really 22 to now. Will this still happen in Ferrari? We'll have to see. That car seems like in a much better spot and much more predictable than the W15. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.